Dr. Albrecht von Müller, take the stage.
Thank you, Ricardo, for these very kind and much too gentle remarks. We are actually studying at that center the foundations and frontiers of thinking since a decade in an interdisciplinary setup where we try to bring all the disciplines that have to contribute to the study of thinking together. It reaches now across 8 disciplines, from neuroscience to philosophy and from evolutionary biology to physics and some other disciplines. What we found is that there's a very interesting interplay between the most fundamental structures of our thinking and the way we perceive reality. And over the years, we started to work more and more also on basic scientific issues, specifically in areas where our brain really has to struggle with the understanding of reality, such as quantum physics and relativity. Because right at these frontiers of thought, we seem to understand best the foundations of thinking. So that's the background, and today I want to focus on one theme, and that is the present. The title of the lecture is, if you can show it. Oh, is it on? Okay. Let's just have a look. Is there anything? Yeah, it's on. There we go. Okay. Yeah, that should be it. It's the forgotten present, and that obviously has a dual meaning. That we forgot about the present. I would argue that's the biggest problem which we have in physics today. I'm not sure that all physicists would agree, but I hope in 10 years there will be more physicists that agree. And I would say forgetting about the present is also a big, big problem in our experience of reality, and even has to do, as we will see during the next few minutes, with some of the big crises into which our civilization maneuvered itself. Let me just try to briefly give you an idea where I'm going in the argument. We normally understand time as a line, the sequential order of events, and then we may or may not have a now, which is an expansionless point just separating past and future. This is the traditional notion of time which dominates our daily life and also most of science, except that in most disciplines this now is gone and you have temporal reversibility, at least across a broad spectrum of theories. What I want to try today is to invert this notion of time and say, why don't we think the following way? There's an expanded present in which, as things take place, sequential time unfolds. Only as events turn into facts, we can separate a past from a prior, and this sequential aspect of time starts to unfold. And if we are getting through with the argument in the 18 minutes that are granted to us, we will see at the end how that may impact on some of the basic questions in physics. Could we go on? Oh yes, it's me. We just jump over that because I always prepare these kind of organizational schemes, but I don't really stick to them. But before coming to this genesis and costs of the facticity imprisonment, which I think goes hand in hand with perceiving time just as a linear sequential order, I would like to do a little experiment with you. Just imagine you are standing at the end of a train. That means that all you can see in the very next moment is gone, and you experience reality as being drawn away all the time. And interestingly enough, in the history of philosophy and science, the person who really elaborated the sequential notion of time first, Aristotle, was also the one to coin the expression, the dent of time. So there's a very close relation between having a predominantly sequential concept of time and the notion that time is pulling away all the time. Now, coming back to this little thought experiment, when you imagine you're standing at the end of the train, what happens is that all is drawn away, and the new things come in the area where you don't see sharply, but you see them disappear in the middle. So the predominant experience of time is the dent of time of being pulled away. What is the logical reaction to this kind of perception of time? Grabbing. I would argue that the predominant paradigm of our civilization, as it is today, is power, possession, and control, and that this is a reaction to the way we perceive time. The argument is that the way we perceive time most profoundly shapes our interaction with reality. Now, question, is there any alternative? And here I'm coming back to the train. Now we are standing at the front end of the train. There, reality all comes towards us, and as it comes, it unfolds. It becomes richer and richer. We see it more and more detail. And when it disappears at the fringes, at the periphery of our perceptive field, and the unfolding is actually in the middle. And the kind of change in the perception of time that I'm arguing for, both in everyday life and in the foundations of science, specifically physics, is exactly that change away from a predominantly sequential notion towards one where we see the present and an expanded, not yet sequentially structured present, as kind of the origin and the primordial structure of time, and only as things take place within that, we then get to the sequential aspect of time. So the sequential aspect of time, in this way of thinking and perceiving time, is a derivative aspect, and the primordial form of time and the origin is the present. Let me just give you a brief overview how it came to the present situation. I hope it comes back. If we just look very briefly at this genesis and the costs of the facticity imprisonment, we see a very early symmetry breaking in favor already directly after the post-Socratic philosophers in favor of binary logic and the linear sequential notion of time. This brought the strength of Western thought. It allowed for the modularity of modern science and technology. This is a very big merit. But it also brought with it some structural blind spots in our ability to think. Specifically in two areas, we became incapable to think the structure of strong self-referentiality, as we see most elegantly in mathematics in Gödel's proof, that there are problems in a Boolean framework or in any formal system strong enough to derive natural numbers. And we got big problems with the phenomenon of autogenesis, meaning that something emerges out of itself. And the most interesting aspects of life are of that nature. beauty, meaning. They all can never be reconstructed in a purely Boolean framework. And with this symmetry breaking in our thinking towards this binary logic and this sequential aspect of time, they go very closely together, we got into this problem of kind of an acquired cognitive blindness for a very crucial aspect of reality. If we now look at the main driving factors of this deprivation, it's the present is reduced to a point, the actual taking place, about which I'm talking in a second, becomes invisible, and reality is reduced to its factual aspect. In science, we see fundamental problems which have not been solved since decades now. The old problem, almost not 100 years, yeah, if we think of Planck, even one can say 100 years, in the foundations of physics, are completely open. We cannot answer the question what life is, because life is inherently autogenetic. If we have not that thought pattern at our disposal, we cannot understand what life is. And likewise, consciousness and mind. So we pay a huge price for this one-sided perception of time on the scientific side. On the worldly side, I already argued that there is this PPC paradigm, possession, power, and control, as the counter-reaction to perceiving time and thus reality as permanently being drawn away. That leads to, if everybody behaves like that, to an explosion of defensive costs and the bad infinity, again, a notion by Aristotle of purely accumulating wealth. Now, what can be done against this? I will now introduce you a way of describing reality if one does exactly that, move from seeing the present as an expansionless point in the middle between past and future to a notion where you have the present as an all-encompassing platform in which, when things occur and when events turn into facts, a prior starts to separate from the past, from the later, and thus sequential time unfolds within the time space of the present. This picture of reality consists of 3 layers. There's the factual layer, the factual aspect of reality, and one can show that their local space-time, binary logic, causality, etc., go very close together. This is a very powerful and important aspect of the taking place of reality, but just one. The next layer, which we see here, is this actual taking place. And those of you who ever came in touch with quantum physics know the so-called measurement problem or the reduction of the wave function. There are fundamental problems in understanding what happens there. There seems to be no causal determination. There seems to be sometimes even a violation of the sequential structure of time. So we have big problems with understanding this layer as long as we look at it in the categories which fit here. As I said, strong self-referentiality is kind of the structural portray of autogenesis, that something develops in and out of itself. And there's a third layer in that so-called triality picture of reality, where you have a radically non-local superposition of all possibilities. This is rather difficult to explain, but I just refer you to experiences that in the cultural evolution appeared almost in all branches of the cultural evolution. We had these ways of addressing an aspect of absolute unity, let's call it like that. And it reappears in a way in modern physics, and some, like Stefan Alexander from Harvard, etc., speculate very interestingly about the relation between the famous quantum vacuum and dark energy. So the point is, the description of reality to which we are getting here is that reality actually has to be seen as almost Borromean rings, has to be seen as the interplay of these three layers of description. This is the classical aspect which we know. This is the actual taking place, which requires a very different way of talking about it, because we must here be able to deal with orthogenesis and strong self-referentiality. And then above that, we have this rather mysterious layer characterized by a high degree of unpredictability. What is interesting is that there seems to be a flow back, because the best description we have for this realm is probably general relativity, and there appear right where orthogenesis and strong self-referentiality appear, namely when gravity starts to impact so strongly on itself that the canvas of local space-time fades away. We see this flux back into this upper layer, which is characterized by this omnidentity or omnipresence, as it has been also called by philosophers. What then happens is that from there, through the actual taking place, we get into this facticity and back. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of philosophy, there's a wonderful saying by Anaximander that where the things come from, they also have to disappear because of the injustice they do against the ordinance of time. Meaning that already there in pre-Socratic philosophy, a certain flow of that kind was described. What I want, and I'm coming to the end now, what I wanted to show you is that this is the perspective we have when we look out at the end of the train. This is more the perspective when we look from the front of the train. So we perceive the actual taking place of reality, the unfolding of reality in continuity, in the non-local time space of the present. And this, just as a side remark, is exactly what is not in contradiction with relativity, because as many of you will know, there's a problem with the present and the now in relativity, but only if we perceive the present as its caricature, as this point like now. It does not exist if we have a more philosophically more meaningful notion of the present, this kind of all-embedding time space in which the actual taking place occurs. So let me end by saying, and coming back to our train metaphor, I think we need to rethink time in a profound way in order to also overcome the practical problems that result from this, namely this paradigm of grabbing, of power, possession, and control, which actually, in civilizational terms, leads to a downward spiral. Thank you.